This video is to accompany the notes in Business Communication Class, Chapter 5, Organizing and Drafting Business Messages. You know, there's informal and there are formal research methods. This first section here talks about informal methods of research and idea generation. Look in office files, talk with your boss, interview the target audience, conduct an informal survey, brainstorm for ideas. It really depends, of course, on the nature of the project. If it's something that's a rehash or, let's say, an update, then, of course, you might be able to, of course, look at the old document, the old survey or whatever it was, talk to people who were involved in that project, get ideas from them. There are probably ways in which they would say, yeah, we would actually do it differently. We would be able to improve this particular aspect of it. Always talking with your boss. I mean, after all, if you've been assigned a project, whether it's in a particular class or whether it's on the job, talk to the boss to find out what he or she is looking for and to get ideas for pursuing the project. I know from my experience in public accounting years ago, you're always going to be faced with situations where that are new to you. And someone has been there before. Someone has, for instance, audited a particular section of the financial statements before. You oftentimes have the old work papers, but you also may be able to consult someone to ask about problem areas. One thing in particular on the job, you don't want to, as they say, spin your wheels. You don't want to ask every possible question. You're going to face challenges and you're going to have to do some investigating on your own. But when you get to the point where you're not making progress and you don't know what to do next, then that's the time just to go back and ask for some help with that. Interviewing the target audience, again, it depends. If this is a seminar you're putting together for factory supervisors, find out what the issues are. Talk to them. Find out what they're interested in learning more about. If they have that opportunity. If you're doing a continuing education program for managers or for accountants or whatever it might be, find out what the relevant issues are. Ask them what they would find interesting and most useful. Conduct an informal survey, same thing really. Brainstorm for ideas. One of the characteristics of a brainstorming session as such is that you want only positive comments. Get as many ideas as you can. It's not a time to take someone's idea and critique it or start trashing it or explaining why that won't work or why we tried it before. You really want a lot of ideas, and you don't want anything to be said or done to discourage the free flow of ideas. Formal research methods include, of course, accessing digital sources. There's so much available out there these days, and you want to be familiar with that. There are also specific databases. Rather than, for instance, just a broad Google search, for instance, there are databases that are financial databases, HR databases, employee salaries, things like that, labor sources, government databases. So you want to find out what those are, because that information might not be accessible through a broad internet search, but the database, in fact, could be free. Search manually. That's old school stuff, but sometimes you might, especially if you've got out-of-print books, it may be the only place you're going to get access to certain information. Investigate primary sources. Interview people. Do surveys. Conduct focus groups. In class we talked about the difference between a primary source and a secondary source. A primary source is a first person, for instance. If you want a primary source in finding out about for instance, how accountants feel about their work, or how they deal with continuing education requirements, and how they face, ethical issues, what they identify as key ethical challenges. Then a primary source is to go to those people through surveys or through, like I said, interviews. I had a friend years ago. He actually interviewed a number of white-collar criminals in a prison in California. He wanted to find out, talk to these people that had embezzled or that had cooked the books, and find out, what happened, what was at the bottom of this. Interestingly enough, he said almost invariably, if someone stole money from the company, it was because they felt like they deserved it. They were underpaid, and so this was some justification for that. But that's a primary source. Anybody, for instance, going to his article and citing it is now dealing with a secondary source. His article itself is secondary, but his sources were primary. Conduct scientific experiments. We don't think about that in business so much, but I've participated in experiments with regard to markets and how they work. And so anyway, there's all of these are possible even in business. Generating ideas and organizing info. How to solve problems and generate ideas through group discussion. Brainstorming. Brainstorming, as I already mentioned, is just a method of getting people together and say, here's an issue or here's a problem. Let's get as many ideas as we can for ways to address this. Maybe to cut cost in a particular area, or to raise revenues, or to improve employee morale, or customer service, those kind of things. As I said, one of the key elements of brainstorming is that there's no evaluation all the ideas. You want a lot of ideas. You don't want to be sidetracked or discourage someone from participating because somebody immediately starts to challenge their ideas. The emphasis on a lot of ideas, quantity, and quality is something you deal with later on. So that ideas are not limited to the first ones or just those proposed by some strong personalities or very outspoken people. You can engage in what's called brain writing. That's where you throw this idea out, but instead of people responding verbally, you have them write down their ideas. And then you can then go to brainstorming if you want to, but people having written down their ideas may be more inclined then to share those. For generating ideas, another way that's become more popular because of the internet is to get people involved online through crowdsourcing, which is where you basically you request ideas or services online. Crowdstorming is getting suggestions and ideas, getting help in filtering or evaluating ideas. And then crowdfunding is getting financial support for a particular project or for a particular cause. You may know somebody who raised money for a particular charity or maybe a mission trip that they wanted to go on through crowdfunding. Then organizing data, of course, one of the most common ways to do that is to conduct or produce an outline. In producing outlines, and you can go on page 163 and 64 and see some specific ideas for outlining. Most of us are used to, of course, outlining and having the main points identified by Roman numerals, subpoints under that is with capital letters, and then going further down, Arabic numerals, the normal 1, 2, 3, and so on that we're used to, and then maybe subpoints with lowercase Roman numerals. Roman letters. Note that unless you have at least 2 points, you don't have subpoints. So if you've got a major point and then under it you've got only one subpoint, then really you need to reformulate your main point so that it includes that subpoint. Maybe your subpoint is just an elaboration of the main point. One of the main, let's say, points we want to recognize, or main things we want to do in crafting a message, of course, besides taking the view that we've talked about, is decide how the audience is going to receive that message. If the audience, the receiver, is going to be happy to receive it, it's good news, for instance, or it's something that's going to be interesting or informative that they will appreciate, or if they're going to be mildly interested, not necessarily happy about it, but not objecting to it, or if in fact they're neutral, a direct pattern is best. And as you can see here from this diagram, the good news is going to be front-loaded. So if the audience is likely to receive the news well, be direct. That is, tell them the good news early. If the audience, in fact, is going to be unwilling or uninterested in the information, or displeased or disappointed by it, maybe even hostile. For instance, they might be uninterested, especially if it's persuasive. You're going to have to win them over. You want them to buy something, to give to something, to sacrifice in some way, maybe even to sacrifice an evening to volunteer for some cause. Or if they're going to be displeased or disappointed, like a job rejection. Maybe they've applied for a job and you're telling them no, you're not being further considered. Maybe it's an application for membership in an organization or for a scholarship. And again, or maybe it's hostile. You're actually rejecting requests they've made for maybe a credit or an adjustment on a bill. Maybe they're being turned down for a loan. So there are any number of things. But if in fact they're not going to be open to or kindly receive the news, then the indirect pattern should be used. And as you can see here, the bad news is going to be delayed and shown later on. So if the audience is not likely to receive the news well, then be indirect. That is, tell them the bad news later. Now, I'll say here's some general advice for managers. This would seem to be contrary to what I've just said. I have a friend who years ago was a vice president for Murphy Oil. Very successful. He has joined MBA JD from the University of Alabama. He was a VP and lived in London, worked in their London office for a number of years. And he mentioned this one time, and I thought it was good advice to share with you. He said, good news can wait. Bad news needs to come out early. And the reason he says this is because if you sit on bad news, and then later people find out you knew the bad news. It could be a bad earnings report. It could be maybe layoffs, and you knew about them, and then maybe you didn't let people know until a month or so down the road. You might have someone, for instance, who says, well, I had another job opportunity that came up. If you had told me when you knew, I could have had this other job, taken this other job, and not lose my job. And now it's too late. That job's already been filled. Good news, though, people are not going to necessarily feel badly if you wait, for instance, to tell them that they're getting a raise or a promotion, or that everybody's getting a raise, or that the company's going to restore the contributions to the retirement plan. So good news can wait. Bad news should come out early. You don't want to sit on that. The other thing, by the way, with regard to that is, if in fact bad news comes out and somebody knows that you knew that ahead of time or earlier and didn't tell them, they may wonder what else, what other bad news do you know about that you're not sharing, and so you come across maybe as less than transparent or even dishonest. Creating effective sentences. Here's a list of things. Recognize phrases and clauses and the difference between them. Use shorter sentences. Be sure to identify and emphasize the important ideas. Use the active voice versus passive voice most of the time. Use the passive voice to de-emphasize the performer or in situations where you want to be especially tactful. And avoid dangling and misplaced modifiers. Now, most of you will recognize these are issues actually we have seen before in our earlier review of grammar issues. Well, let's look at each of these in turn just to see what's included here, or at least what's contemplated in this particular, why it's relevant in this particular chapter. First of all, clauses have subject and verbs and phrases do not. Independent clauses are complete and dependent clauses are not. So here's an example. An independent clause, they were eating cold pizza. A dependent clause, that they want to return for a refund. And a phrase, notice, to return for a refund. You notice the dependent clause by itself doesn't really make any sense. It's got a subject and a verb, but it doesn't stand on its own as a complete thought. And of course, the phrase to return for a refund is not, it doesn't have a verb at all. Let's pick up here for the next video.